Intro. Hi, I'm Julie, and I'm here to tell you the tale of how my world was flipped upside down twice. Perhaps it would be best if I began at the beginning. Larry and Joanna David were my wonderful parents, and I came into this world in a little town in the suburbs. I came from a family of journalists. My mother was a nurse. We were content despite our lack of wealth. Prior to my 14th birthday, everything was relatively ordinary. Suddenly, the tide turned. On Friday night, it rained. I was at home with my grandma, watching a ridiculous cartoon while my folks were traveling home after a dinner party. The sound of my grandma's gentle sobs in the kitchen sent shivers down my spine the moment the phone rang. A haze enveloped the subsequent days. Rumor has it that Mom passed away on the spot in the collision. Dad was able to escape, albeit narrowly. My last encounter with him was in the hospital, and he barely resembled the man I knew before. He would never walk again, according to the doctor, because his legs were crushed. While he reached for my hand, he muttered, "Julie, I'm so sorry, my darling. I deeply apologize." His apology seemed puzzling to me. A drunk driver was at fault. He was not at fault when their automobile was hit. However, as I matured, I came to see that his sorrow extended to our lives as they had transformed, the challenges we were destined to encounter, the mother I had lost, and the father he felt he could no longer be. However, Larry David, my dad, was more capable than he ever let on. He dove headfirst into his job once he left the hospital and adapted to his wheelchair. Being an editor at the city's leading newspaper consumed him completely. He had always had a gift for writing. The adolescent years? My dad made sure I had what I needed when I approached my teenage years. He told me to get involved, meet people, and live my life normally. The reality, though, was that I enjoyed his company more. We fought about literature, watched classic films, and he even helped me with my assignments. I went away to college against my dad's wishes when the time came. "You need to fly, my darling," he said. "I'll be all right, so there's no need to fret." Despite my reservations, I could feel he was correct. Thus, I enrolled in a university. The State University of New York is where I earned my bachelor's degree in accounting. So did I meet Emma, the woman who would later become my best friend. Paul, her second cousin, was introduced to me by Emma. Paul was witty and compassionate. He took my confession about my dad with stride. Actually, he and Dad hit it off immediately upon meeting for the first time, forming a strong bond over their mutual appreciation of old rock. "Your dad is cool, and you're amazing for taking care of him all these years," Paul shared with me later. I tried to play it off, but inside I was glowing. For the first time since the accident, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could have a normal life, a life with love, laughter, and even a family of my own someday. After graduation, things started to fall into place like a puzzle. I got a job at the local tax service, and Paul started working as a long-haul truck driver. We dated for 4 years before he proposed to me on a crisp autumn evening in the park where we had our first date. I was thrilled, but there was one thing I needed to make clear. "Yes, Paul," I said, "but I can't leave my dad. He needs me." Paul smiled wide and said, "I wouldn't have it any other way. We'll all live together. Your dad's apartment is big enough for the 3 of us, right?" The wedding was small but beautiful. Dad insisted on wheeling himself down the aisle to give me away. There wasn't a dry eye in the place. As I stood there, holding Paul's hand, I felt like I was living a fairy tale. But every fairy tale has its villains. Mine came in the form of my mother-in-law, Maria, and my sister-in-law, Olivia. From the moment I met them, I could tell they didn't approve of me. "So, your father is handicapped?" Maria asked during our first meeting, wrinkling her nose like she smelled something bad. "He's disabled," I corrected, trying to stay calm. "But he works as an editor," she interrupted, clearly not interested. Then she turned to Paul and asked, "Are you sure about this? There are so many nice girls from good families." I felt my face flush with anger and embarrassment, but Paul immediately defended me. "Mom, Julie is from a good family. Her dad's disability doesn't change that. I love her, and that's all that matters." That shut Maria up, but I could still see the disapproval in her eyes. Olivia, following her mother's lead, was just as cold towards me. After the wedding, true to his word, Paul moved in with Dad and me, and our life settled into a comfortable routine. I'd go to work at the tax office while Paul was on the road for days at a time. When he was home, we'd all have dinner together, but whenever Maria and Olivia visited, the atmosphere in our home changed. They acted like they owned the place, barely acknowledging Dad's presence. Once I overheard Maria whispering to Olivia, "It's a shame. Paul could have done so much better. Now he's stuck with this girl and her crippled father. What if they have children? Can you imagine the genes?" I was furious, but I kept quiet for Paul's sake. I tried to keep the peace, but it was getting harder and harder. One evening, after a particularly tense visit from Maria and Olivia, broke down in tears. Paul found me in our bedroom, crying. Hey, he said, pulling me into his arms. "What's wrong?" "Your mom and sister," I sobbed. "They hate me. They think I'm not good enough for you because of Dad." Paul's face hardened. "That's ridiculous. You and your dad are my family now. If they can't accept that, it's their problem, not ours." His words comforted me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of our troubles with Maria and Olivia. As the months went by, Paul's trucking business began to grow. He was always on the road, traveling across the country in his big rig. I missed him terribly when he was gone, but I focused on my work at the tax office and spent my evenings keeping Dad company. One crisp autumn evening, as I was helping Dad into bed, Paul called. His voice crackled with excitement over the phone. "Julie, I've been thinking," he said. "How would you feel about buying a townhouse? It would be easier for your dad to move around in a wheelchair. He could spend more time outside, plus you could have a garden, something to keep you busy when I'm on the road." The more he talked, the more I liked the idea. I glanced at Dad, who was pretending not to eavesdrop. "What do you think, Dad?" I asked, putting the phone on speaker. Dad's eyes lit up. "A garden would be nice," he admitted, "and it would be easier to get outside." That settled it. Over the next few weeks, we threw ourselves into house hunting. Our new home. We finally found the perfect place, a spacious townhouse with wide doorways, a roll-in shower for Dad, and a beautiful backyard. Taking out a mortgage was scary. With Paul's income, mine, and the rent from Dad's old apartment, we managed to make it work. We moved in on a sunny Sunday in spring, and I'll never forget the look on Dad's face as he wheeled himself out onto our new patio. "This is perfect, sweetie," he said, his eyes misty. "Thank you." We spent the next few months settling in and making the place our own. I planted a small vegetable garden, and Dad would sit outside for hours, enjoying the sunshine and fresh air. It was peaceful, almost perfect. The housewarming party? Then we decided to have a housewarming party. We invited friends, colleagues, and yes, even Maria and Olivia. The party was in full swing when they showed up, fashionably late as usual. They walked in, looking around with barely hidden envy. As we walked through the house, I could see Maria thinking about something. When we reached the master bedroom, she turned to me with a sly smile. "You know, Julie," she said quietly, "this would be perfect for Paul and me. Why don't you send your father to a nursing home? Then I could move in here." I felt like I'd been slapped. "Excuse me," I managed to say. "Oh, don't look so shocked," Maria continued. "Your father isn't well. He's not a whole person anymore, is he? He doesn't need all this luxury. A nursing home would be more than enough for someone in his condition." Before I could respond, Maria marched out to the patio where Dad was talking with some guests. Maria's outburst, to my horror, she grabbed the handles of his wheeled chair and started pushing him toward the driveway. "Maria," I shouted, running after her, "what are you doing?" "If he won't go to a nursing home, he can stay outside," she sneered. "That's what you wanted, isn't it? For him to be outdoors." I was shaking with rage and disbelief. Thankfully, Paul heard the commotion and came running. His face turned red with anger when he saw what his mother was doing. "Mom," he yelled, "what the hell are you doing? Let go of Larry's chair right now." Maria looked shocked by Paul's tone. "But honey, I was just—" "I don't want to hear it." Paul cut her off. "You and Olivia need to leave. Now." After they left, Paul apologized over and over to Dad and me. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I had no idea she would do that. I'm just so sorry." Dad reached out and patted Paul's hand. "It's not your fault, son," he said gently. "Some people just can't understand." Life settled into a new routine after that incident. Maria and Olivia kept their distance, which was fine with me. Paul focused on his work, taking on more long-haul routes to help pay for our new home. I split my time between my job at the tax office, taking care of our home, and looking after Dad. 4 years later. 4 years passed quickly. Our life became comfortable and predictable. Paul was on the road most of the time, but when he was home, our little family was happy. Dad's health was stable, and he seemed content, spending his days in the garden or working on his editing from home. Then came the call that shattered my world. I was at work when my phone rang. A man's unfamiliar voice greeted me. "Mrs. Walker, this is Officer Andrew from the Highway Patrol." My heart sank. "Yes," I barely managed to say. "I'm sorry to inform you that your husband, Paul Walker, has been in a serious accident." The rest of the conversation was a blur, words like head-on collision, and didn't make it floated around me, but I couldn't understand them. It wasn't until I heard myself thanking the officer and hanging up that the reality began to hit me. Paul was gone. The next week was a fog of grief and disbelief. I went through the motions of planning the funeral like a robot, barely understanding what was happening. The day before the funeral, I gathered my courage and called Maria. I thought she deserved to hear about her son's death from me, not from a newspaper obituary. "Hello," Maria's sharp voice answered. "Maria, it's Julie," I said, my voice trembling. "It's about Paul. He's gone. There was an accident." There was silence on the other end of the line, and then, to my shock, Maria's voice came back dripping with anger. "This is your fault," she hissed. "You made him work so hard, driving that truck to pay for your fancy house. You killed my son." I was stunned. "Maria, that's not—" "Save it," she snapped. "I expect you to give him the best funeral money can buy, but don't expect a penny from us. You made your bed. Now lie in it." The line went dead. The funeral. The day of Paul's funeral was gray and rainy, matching my mood perfectly. The church was full. Paul was well liked in the community, and it seemed like half the town had come to pay their respects. After the service, as people passed by to offer their condolences, I noticed that Paul's mother and sister were nowhere to be seen. They hadn't even bothered to show up for their own son and brother's funeral. Dad reached out and squeezed my hand. "It's their loss, sweetie. We're family, and we'll get through this together." Returning home, as we pulled into our driveway, something seemed off. The lights were on in the house, which was strange because I was sure I had turned everything off before we left. "Did you leave any lights on, Dad?" I asked, frowning. He shook his head. "No, I don't think so." As we got closer, I noticed movement inside the house. My heart started pounding. Were we being robbed on the day of Paul's funeral? I quickly helped Dad out of the car and into his wheelchair, my mind racing. Should I call the police? But as we approached the front door, I heard familiar voices inside. A chill ran down my spine as I recognized them. Maria and Olivia. I pushed open the door to find Maria and Olivia in our living room, surrounded by boxes and pieces of furniture. What the hell is going on here? I demanded, my grief momentarily forgotten in the face of this outrageous intrusion. Maria turned to me, her face a mask of fake sympathy. "Oh, Julie, dear, we're just helping you pack up. After all, you can't possibly afford to keep this place now that Paul is gone." I was speechless. Olivia added, her voice sickeningly sweet, "Don't worry. You can go back to your father's apartment. It's cozy." I could feel the anger building inside me. "Get out," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Get out of my house right now." Maria had the nerve to look offended. "This house belongs to us now. All of Paul's property does. We're his family, after all." "Like hell you are." I exploded. "Where were you today at his funeral?" "Oh, that's right. You couldn't be bothered to show up." Maria waved her hand dismissively. "We were busy making arrangements. Now be a good girl and start packing. We'll meet you out by tomorrow." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These women hadn't shed a tear for Paul, hadn't even attended his funeral, and now they were trying to kick us out of our home. "I'm calling the police," I said, pulling out my phone. Maria and Olivia exchanged worried looks. They clearly hadn't expected me to fight back. "Now, Julie," Maria began, but I cut her off. "No, you have exactly 10 minutes to get out of my house before I call the cops. This is my home. Paul and I bought it together. You have no right to be here." Maybe it was the steel in my voice or the fire in my eyes, but Maria and Olivia finally realized they had gone too far. They gathered their things and left, but not before Maria turned to me with a sneer. "This isn't over, Julie. You'll be hearing from our lawyers after the funeral." The days after Paul's funeral were a blur of grief, anxiety, and paperwork. I threw myself into sorting out Paul's affairs, partly to keep busy and partly out of fear that Maria and Olivia would try to take what wasn't theirs. A week after the funeral, I received a call from a local law firm. My heart pounded as I answered the call, afraid it was Maria following through on her threat of legal action. "Mrs. Walker," a crisp, professional voice asked. "This is Scott Thompson from Thompson and Partners. I'm calling about your late husband's will." I felt a small flicker of hope. "His will? I didn't know he had one." "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Walker came to see us about 5 months ago. He asked that we contact you in the event of his passing." I scheduled an appointment for the next day, my mind spinning. Why hadn't Paul told me about this? What did it mean? The appointment. The next morning, I wheeled Dad into Mr. Thompson's office. The lawyer greeted us warmly, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "Mrs. Walker, Mr. David, thank you for coming in," he said, gesturing for us to sit near his desk. "I'm sorry for your loss." Mr. Thompson opened a file on his desk. "Now, as I mentioned on the phone, your husband came to see us to draft his will. He was very clear about his wishes." I held my breath as Mr. Thompson began to read. "I, Paul Walker, being of sound mind, do hereby leave all my worldly possessions to my beloved wife, Julie Walker." I gasped, and Dad's grip on my hand tightened. "This includes our home, my truck, and all our savings. It is my wish that Julie use these resources to care for herself and her father, Larry David, whom I have come to love as my own." Tears streamed down my face. Even from beyond the grave, Paul was taking care of us. "There's more," Mr. Thompson said gently. "Mr. Walker left a letter for you." He handed me an envelope. With shaking hands, I opened it and began to read. My dear Julie, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I'm so sorry for leaving you and Larry. Please know that you two are the best thing that ever happened to me. I made this will because I know how my mother and sister can be. I didn't want to worry you, but I needed to make sure you and Larry were protected if anything happened to me. You're my real family, Julie. You and Larry, not them. Take care of each other, live your lives to the fullest, and know that I'll always be watching over you. All my love, Paul. I clutched the letter to my chest, sobbing. Dad was crying too, his weathered hand patting my arm. There's one more thing. Mr. Thompson gave us a moment before speaking again. Mrs. Walker, your husband's truck was insured. Given the circumstances of the accident, the insurance company will be paying out the full value of the policy. I looked up, sniffling, and asked, "What does that mean?" Mr. Thompson gave me a small smile. "It means you'll be receiving a large sum of money, enough to pay off your mortgage and more." Leaving the lawyer's office. As we left the lawyer's office, I felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. We were going to be okay. Paul had made sure of it. As we pulled into our driveway, I noticed a familiar car parked on the street. My heart sank as I recognized Maria's sleek sedan. "Oh no," I muttered. Sure enough, Maria and Olivia were waiting on our front porch. But this time I wasn't afraid. I had Paul's letter in my pocket and the strength of his love in my heart. "Julie," Maria began as we approached, her voice sickly sweet, "we need to talk about Paul's estate." I stood tall, looking her straight in the eye. "No, Maria, we don't. Paul left everything to me. It's all legal and official. Do you want to know why? Because we were his real family, not you. Now please leave. You're trespassing on my property." For once, Maria was speechless. Olivia tugged at her arm, whispering urgently. With one last venomous glare, they got in their car and drove away. The weeks that followed, the weeks after our meeting with the lawyer, were busy. I threw myself into settling Paul's affairs, grateful for the distraction from my grief. The insurance payout came through, and just as Mr. Thompson had said, it was enough to pay off our mortgage with plenty left over. One afternoon, as I was going through Paul's desk, I found a small notebook. Curious, I opened it and saw pages filled with his messy handwriting. It was a journal of sorts, full of his thoughts and plans for our future. Thinking about starting a college fund for our future kids. One entry read, "Want to make sure they have the best start in life." My heart clenched. We had talked about having children someday, but had decided to wait until we were more financially stable. Now, reading Paul's private hopes and dreams, I felt a fresh wave of grief wash over me. "Oh, Paul," I whispered, holding the notebook close. "We had so many plans." A new discovery. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. My mind kept drifting to the journal, to the future we'd never have. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of Paul. He was smiling, holding out his hand to me. "It's okay, Julie," he said in my dream. "Everything's going to be all right." I woke up the next morning feeling different. I couldn't quite figure out what it was, but something had changed. As I got ready for work, a wave of nausea hit me, and I barely made it to the bathroom in time. The morning sickness didn't go away in the days that followed. At first, I thought it was just stress and grief, but a small voice in the back of my mind suggested something else. After a week of this, I found myself in the pharmacy, staring at pregnancy tests. With trembling hands, I bought one and hurried home. The 5 minutes I waited for the result felt like the longest of my life. When I finally looked at the test, there were 2 clear blue lines. I sank to the bathroom floor, overwhelmed by a mix of emotions, joy, fear, grief, and hope, all swirling together. "Julie," Dad's voice came through the door. "Everything okay in there?" I opened the door, tears streaming down my face. Dad's expression changed from concern to alarm. "What's wrong, sweetie?" he asked. I held up the test, my hand shaking. "I'm pregnant, Dad." I fell into his arms, sobbing. He held me, stroking my hair like he used to when I was a little girl. "It's okay," he murmured. "It's going to be okay. You're not alone, Julie. And this baby is a gift, a piece of Paul that will live on." His words hit me deeply. This baby was a part of Paul, a continuation of our love. Suddenly, the fear began to fade, replaced by a strong determination. "You're right," I said, wiping my eyes. "This baby is a gift, and we're going to be okay." Dad smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's my girl. Now let's get you something to eat. You're eating for two now, after all." The days that followed, as we headed to the kitchen, I felt a sense of hope growing inside me. The road ahead would be challenging, but with my father by my side and Paul's child growing inside me, I knew we could face anything. As my belly grew with our child, I found strength I never knew I had. Dad was my rock, always there with a kind word or a helping hand. We settled into a new routine, just the two of us, eagerly awaiting the arrival of the newest member of our little family. Another visit. I was tending to the garden that Dad and I had planted together one lovely afternoon when I heard a car pull up. When I saw Maria Seddon, my stomach dropped. What on earth could they desire at this moment? As I made my way to the front door, my fingers went limp against my bloated stomach. Olivia and Maria stood on our porch, appearing slightly anxious and uneasy. "Julie," Maria said, her voice devoid of its customary acerbic quality, "we should definitely have a conversation with you." I waited for her to finish before speaking, raising an eyebrow, but keeping my mouth shut. Olivia awkwardly raised her voice and said, "We've hit some hard times." Her expression betrayed her anxiety. "We were hoping to stay in the flat that belonged to your dad till we are able to stand again." What I was hearing was unbelievable. It was galling that they dared to ask for more after everything they had done to us. Speaking in a calm but forceful tone, I apologized. "That is simply not feasible. My need to converse with you has been sated." When Maria laid eyes on my growing baby bump, her brow furrowed. A mix of horror and shock contorted her features. "Are you expecting a child?" I spat, she said. "Is it already? You small? Leprosy. Your discovery of a new man is just mind-boggling. Even when buried, Paul's body remains warm." Suppressed an overwhelming rush of rage. It was Paul's child, but I didn't feel the need to explain that. Such an aunt and grandma would be too much for my unborn child to handle. Rather, I grinned, a subtle, suspicious grin that appeared to frighten Maria even more. "Your opinion on my private life is irrelevant," I stated in a composed manner. "It seems like you should go now." Maria seemed to be trying to convey more, but she must have been put off by my reaction. Gripping Olivia's arm, she pivoted on her heel. As I observed their go, a feeling of tranquility engulfed me. I had maintained my honor, stood firm for my loved ones, and prevented harm. Had he lived, Paul would be proud.